The President of the United States, in a joint press conference with the leader of our top geopolitical rival, Vladimir Putin, said he trusted them more than his own intelligence agencies. We talked about it civilly. Nothing changed. It is too late for convicted civility. We look at the current state of affairs in our country. Not only are we far too polarized for convicted civility to make a difference, but there are many situations where convicted civility isn't an acceptable response. But before we get into the detail of the government position, you're probably wondering what we even mean when we say convicted civility. So let us examine that first. The phrase convicted civility is a combination of two words, obviously. Convicted, which means the state of having a firmly held belief or opinion, and civility, which means polite and good-mannered behavior. Now, taking these two words into context and drawing from the work of Dr. Richard Mao, the meaning of convicted civility is having strong beliefs that you are able to bring out or discuss in a peaceful, polite manner without shutting down any group that has contradicting opinions. Now, a second point needed to understand this topic is that this debate is about not the morality of convicted civility, not about whether it makes us feel good or makes us happy or is a good thing, but rather its effectiveness in today's society. Basically, does it make a difference? Civility or uncivility? Finally, the last point is that by too late, it is meant that we must show that it is ineffective in the modern era. Now, much like kombucha, convicted civility makes you feel good, but it doesn't actually do anything. So, now that we understand the question at hand, let's analyze the government position. The first main point is that although the idea of convicted civility can often be a good thing and sometimes even a necessary thing, our society is far too gone into divisiveness and polarization for civility to change things. We as humans are naturally divided. We divide ourselves into tribes, avoiding and spurning those that disagree with us. In our society today, this than ever before, with a 36% gap in political values between Democrats and Republicans compared to a 15% gap in 1994. It's been seen all over the world as well, in issues such as the French, Polish, and Brazilian elections, the tensions between the United States and its allies such as NATO, brewing trade wars, gridlock in the U.S. Congress, Brexit, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Attempts at civility in these polarized environments go mostly unheard and unnoticed. At this point, convicted civility is ineffective to the point that it is potentially immoral and causes more harm. Now let's look at the second main point that really gets into that harm. The second main point is for the government team is that convicted civility is often an inadequate response for certain societies, people groups, and in particular, contexts. Attempting to be civil can even sometimes worsen the situation. Indeed, many situations call for uncivil behavior.
All right, we have a question from Twitter. It says, is an uncivil discussion exactly what is happening now? Doesn't that prove that lack of civility doesn't work?
All right, two main things on that. First, the problem with the uncivil discourse is that it is still too civil. Simply name-calling isn't true incivility. Instead, we need to break the rules, break the norms and the standards that we have set in society today. A great example of this is just the other day, Cory Booker in the Senate confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh basically threw out all the Senate rules, risking his own expulsion from the Senate in order to stand up to something. In addition to that, the second main point on this topic is that when we as individuals make the decision to be civil, to have convicted civility, we can't at the same time force others to be civil. This means that we're civil and those who hate us are not. That makes us the victims. We see this too often in the past where we are civil, where minorities are civil, where women are civil, and the people who are oppressing them are not made to be civil. This results, and this attitude is simply unacceptable. So let's move on to what I was saying, is that examples where civility simply doesn't work. For example, dehumanization is occurring, uncivil behavior is usually necessary. Now, dehumanization can occur in many forms, some worse than others. Racism and sexism are both forms of dehumanization that can occur in many forms. Racism and sexism are both forms of dehumanization rampant in our society that often requires an uncivil response. When white supremacists march on Charlottesville, having civil discussion with them will change nothing about the hate they spew. Meanwhile, the uncivil and even violent response that occurred in that city prevented them from marching the next year in Charlottesville and caused the white supremacist march in D.C. in August of 2018 to be a complete and total failure. In fact, the white nationalists were outnumbered 1 to 100 by counter-protesters, and they had to end their rally before it was even scheduled to begin. You see, the idea that unapologetic bigotry and white ethnocentrism can be defeated by congeniality or lukewarm messages of tolerance is frightening demonstration of naivete. When there is a culture for powerful men to take advantage of women, civil discussion does nothing. Meanwhile, we have seen a revolution with the very uncivil discourse of the Me Too movement and the Women's March. Calling someone out, potentially wrecking their professional and personal lives, is incredibly uncivil, yet it is the most effective way to deal with the problem at hand.
We have another question from the audience. We talk about decades of civil discourse on issues like sexism, but I would argue there has been just silence. What are some examples of the civil discourse over the past decades?
Well, part of civil discourse is legal framework that has been established to fight against sexual assault and racism. Now, plenty of laws have been passed to try and solve these issues, which is a good thing, but it simply isn't enough. You see, instead, we must be willing to call out those who are abusive, rather than simply telling the victims to be civil. It is too often that we silence women, essentially saying that they have to be polite to the individuals who ruin their lives, while we allow the individuals who ruin their lives to be as uncivil as they want. Convicted civility opens the door for that abuse to occur. That's why we must stand against convicted civility. Now, moving on to what I was saying, according to the BBC in May 2018, the Me Too movement and the call-out culture that surrounds it has directly led to an increase in protection of abuse victims, an increase in the prosecution of abusers, and a decrease in workplace sexual harassment. You see, after decades of civil discourse on the topic changing nothing, it was uncivil behavior that has made a difference. In conclusion, as Friedrich Nietzsche once said, madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, peoples, and ages, it is the rule. Not only is the current political environment far too divisive and polarized for convicted civility to be heard, but there are far too many cases where convicted civility flat out fails. It is not only impossible to bring people together to discuss their issues and make sure everyone understands where everyone is coming from, but attempting so avoids attacking the problems in an effective way. Yes, it's a fundamental civil attitude to ensure that everyone can talk about their beliefs in an open space. But we have racists marching on our Capitol. It is not time for convicted civility. When the White House calls for the elimination of opposing media sources, it is not time for convicted civility. When we have the President of the United States locking children in cages, it is not time for convicted civility. You see, it is time for us to stand up and do what is ever necessary to stop hate, bigotry, and corruption, civil or uncivil. For these reasons, because we as a society must take a stand, it is clear that it is too late for convicted civility. Thank you.
Yes, seeing children be put in cages and seeing sexual harassment run rampant in our society is indeed something we should not tolerate. But we on the side of the opposition understand that what underpins those problems is a lack of civility in our society. It is the assumption that somehow my own worldview, my own ideas of what is right and wrong must be the only version. We think when we operate in that type of the world, things only get worse. We think the solution to the problems we see today is to not go towards being uncivil, but is to step towards convicted civility. So, the first question in my speech today, what exactly do we think this debate is about? First, we would say this debate isn't about extreme conservatives or extreme liberals. Instead, we think it's about the moderates. It's about the majority of people. What do we think the majority is going to respond better to when it comes to swaying their opinions or actions? Is it being shouted out that they're clearly wrong, or is it being engaged with and having thoughtful discussions? We think it's always going to be the latter that's going to be the most productive. But second, what we think this debate is about how exactly should we shape our discourse in our two competing worlds. On the side of the government, we see a type of discourse that is characterized by personal attacks, by public shaming, by being emotional and reactive. We think that that type of discourse doesn't solve issues, it only makes them worse. On the side of the opposition, we would tell you that we believe in a type of discourse that is modeled after convicted civility, which says, yes, you can have strong convictions, but they should be presented in a way that doesn't have to do with ad hominem attacks, that seeks truth in a way that is fair and just. Meaning that convicted civility is not being passive, it's not being silent in the face of injustice. Instead, we think it means ensuring that our speech is critical, is effective, and most of all, it is proactive. So that's what we think the debate is about today. Second question we need to be asking ourselves is, what is so unique about today that we need to have some type of new thing to solve our issues? Luke tries to tell you that in our world, things are so much more divided that convicted civility simply won't work, but we think that reading off a list of statistics and numbers was an inadequate explanation of why exactly it is too late. Instead, we'll be showing you why the things that make today unique warrant why we need convicted civility even more.
We have a question from the audience. Are you at all concerned that typically it is the oppressed groups who are asked to be civil?
We think that marginalized groups are rightfully enraged, but we think that that type of rage should be channeled into a type of discourse and a type of action that's going to be constructive, not the type of discourse that is explosive. So, going back to why we think what makes today unique, why that warrants having convicted civility. What we tell you is that in the age of the internet, that these types of things of social media only magnify the harms we already have seen with division in the past. First, because social media makes it a lot easier to say more extreme and more hateful things because you're allowed to hide behind a screen instead of having to interact with another human being and seeing that face-to-face interaction. But second, we would tell you that it incentivizes quick responses that don't allow for critical thought or research. And lastly, we would tell you that social media only reinforces our own worldviews at the point where it simply shows you posts and other uses that agree with what you say. Meaning, we think what speech looks like in the status quo is that it's characterized by being overly aggressive, by being divisive, by lacking in critical thought, and most of all, being insulated from any type of dissenting opinion, because social media just shows us what the opposition looks like, but through our own eyes, not through theirs. We think for those reasons that now more than ever, we need to have convicted civility. We need to intentionally forget what our own views are and seek to look at what others' views are instead. What the government tells you is that no, we should simply just attack people without having any type of dialogue beforehand, but we think that very type of idea is what entrenches divisions and only increases the gap. On our side, we think convicted civility requires us to look beyond our screens and realize that there is another human being at the other end as well. Now, the third thing we think this debate is asking us to say is how exactly can convicted civility address the very real issues and harms we see coming from division?
Another question, is it being too nice and passive exactly the problem? For example, people in the Republican Party who disagree with Trump but empower him through not confronting him.
Yeah, so like we said, convicted civility is not choosing to be silent or choosing to be passive. We think with convicted civility, you can still confront people you might not agree with, but we think the difference between that, when you actually confront, you're having an engagement, you're having a debate, versus on their side, they simply attack without trying to understand why that person might have that opinion in the first place. So, once again, going back to how do we think convicted civility addresses these issues we see coming out of division? First, we would tell you, it acknowledges that there's not simply one version of the truth. We think it's important we step outside of the government's conception of this hyper-liberal framework they've provided and see that uncivility isn't just brought out by conservatives, it's also used just as much as by liberals as well. For instance, when we say all Trump supporters must be racist, we don't think that even attempts to solve issues of actual racism and other things as well. Instead, we think those types of issues probably get worse on their side at the point when people feel attacked, only get more re-entrenched in their own views. Instead, on our side, when we choose to ask these people, okay, what were the underlying motivations for why you voted this way, we come to understand that those motivations were mainly out of things like economic insecurities and feeling left behind by a government that they saw is only wanting to prop up the wealthy few. We think those are legitimate views that people can have, but when we operate in the government world, we say, you voted for Trump, you must be a racist, we never see the legitimate things and ideas people have, meaning problems such as like economic insecurities that we see happen going on in the Rust Belt never come to light in their world. Instead, on their side, those problems only fester in the dark and they only get worse. On our side, when we choose to critically engage other people that we might not agree with, we actually allow these issues to come to light. We actually have a discussion on them that helps us all get closer to solving them in the first place. We think that's the first reason of why convicted civility is going to be a lot better at addressing the harms of division. But the last thing we would say is that it reaffirms human dignity. We actually agree with Luke on this point, that when we're thinking of social ills as racism, sexism, xenophobia, the root cause of them is dehumanization. But what we don't agree with on Luke's side is that at the point where you demonize and vilify people and the type of rhetoric they set up, we think those are the very things that cause dehumanization. When you begin to associate a person simply with what they're saying, you see them only as being an idea rather than a human, making it so much easier to see them as something that's not human, making it easier to have violent and often very oppressive responses to them. We think that yes, they've identified the issue of dehumanization, but they only perpetuate it more by partaking in rhetoric and behavior that only increases it. What we tell you is that if we actually want to solve these problems, we must engage in a type of convicted discourse that realizes that we are not the only ones that can see truth, that there are other versions of it as well. We think what convicted civility does is, yes, it allows us to have our own ideas too, but it forces us to understand that it's not just us in the world, that there are other people that are always going to think differently, but that doesn't mean that they're somehow less than we are. We think when we live in a world without convicted civility, we live in a world where the knowledge of our shared humanity is simply drowned out by white noise. We think when we live in a world of convicted civility, we live in a world that sees that things are not just black and white. Thank you.
First off, I'd like to address what she said about statistics and numbers not being an adequate explanation. What we showed you in 2017, there's a 36% political gap between liberals and conservatives compared to the 15% in 1994. This shows you the gap between them is even bigger. So taking the effort to actually even talk about it is causing more problems than actually solving the issues we have. Then she brought up the point that by dehumanizing people, that by bringing up civil discourse, we don't dehumanize people. But the fact is this: by talking with each other and talking to somebody who disagrees with you, you tend to dehumanize them to make your opinion seem better than theirs, hence making them seem less of a human, and their opinion is not heard. Again, we brought up, as he had said, that minorities tend to be discriminated. And an example would bring is Martin Luther King. He was accused by the majority of being uncivil, and they used civility to keep him quiet. That's another thing. So by keeping people quiet, we're not solving any issues. Another issue is when we saw how the UN reacted in North Korea. They brought in sanctions that basically didn't shut anything down with the nuclear threat. They just basically told them, we're going to do something civil. They did not solve the problem. Right now, they have nuclear weapons that can basically kill anyone. Did they solve a problem there? No. What are we doing by talking? What is talking doing? Give me 5 examples of countries that have solved their problems by talking them out and being peaceful about the solution. By breaking character and actually going into these issues that we can go into our traditional manners of finding our finding solution, we are doing better to our community than actually just sitting there. Then again, we talked about why is it too late? People are, if I sit in a room and still talk to somebody and they don't want to listen to me, what will I solve? How will you solve it? It's too late. That's the fact is. As he said, we do not want to change, we're not trying to change the mind. That's the fact is, we cannot change somebody's mind. But at least we're trying to change the negative impact that is being caused in the society. He talked about how white supremacists are marching in societies. We're talking about how rapists are being shut down by the victims coming out. The fact is, she said it might work. As Albert Einstein once said, insanity is trying something twice and hoping for a different solution. The fact is this: if you have already tried it and it failed, why can't you try something new that will actually give us a chance of working better? If it has failed already in the society, what will you do different that will actually make it work better in a society? Then again, let me give you examples of how talking actually brought into humanization. If you looked at the Rwandan genocide, people talked a lot. They talked. But what happened? Tutsis were dehumanized. They're called cockroaches. What happened? They were killed. What happened? People still talked about it. During this time of the genocide, people were talking about the definition of genocide in America, and in actually higher power countries were talking about the definition of genocide. But did they solve anything? No, they were being civil. If they had actually intervened with military force, what would happen? The genocide would have been stopped. If you look at the Holocaust, what people were doing at that time, what people were talking about with the war, people were just sitting there and talking. What has talking solved that what we do will not solve? How has convicted civility solved any of this? How was slavery solved by sitting down and actually talking? Wasn't it solved by actually taking an action and doing something forcefully and then solving the action? Again, we go back to the point that you talked about how we'll talk to the moderates. These moderates are not doing anything. Wouldn't it be more effective to target those who are actually committing the acts of these damaging acts, the extremists? Wouldn't it be more efficient to actually go to them and stop them for doing this? What is more efficient? Will it be talking to those who do not care or those who are actually committing the acts? What has been efficient? As he talked about the DC March, they were outnumbered because people took an action instead of what? Sitting down and talking. What has talking solved so far? The UN has been talking for years and years and years on end. How many wars have they resolved? How many genocides have they stopped? Can you show me that? Again, sorry. Again, what? Okay. Sorry. Convicted civility, okay, in a perfect world, as I conclude, I want to say this. In a perfect world, convicted civility would work. But the harsh reality, we don't live in a perfect world, and that's the truth. It looks so perfect on paper, but when you bring it up, what is happening? No one is listening to each other. The polarization gap is too big for us to actually come down and find a solution. What common ground do we have that we can use as a way to speak up? There is none. So unless you can show us there's a gap, there's a platform for us to actually come and speak together and find a solution to all these problems, then as it is, it's not going to happen. Thank you very much. Now, I'm happy because today's government clearly shows that they're too civil to be convicted. Because the speaker here talks about the Rwandan genocide, and she talks about how talking led to dehumanization. But she's just looking at one side of the story. Because yes, leaders talked and they used propaganda to dehumanize. But what happened after the genocide, and what is Rwanda after the genocide? The leaders used the same talking that they used to dehumanize people to bring them back together, to actually tell them that they can be different but have the same convictions, which means that the government that we have here chooses to look at one side of the story, which is the negative side, but doesn't choose to look at the positive side. Luke says that we're far too polarized for convicted civility. And so, what if we're far too polarized? Should we stop it? Should we let it stay like that? Should we have a polarized, nation because we are far too polarized? That's a question that they did not answer. And then they make an argument about, they say that tribalism is at its worst, and that's why it's too ineffective for a modern era. But if tribalism and divisionism is at worst in this era, what can we do for it? Are we going to let it become like that? Are we going to let it degenerate to the point where there's violence, mass killings, and things as big as the genocide? My first speaker clearly talks about that convicted civility does not remove the fact that people are different, but it means that convicted civility simply means that people can have a discourse and can have a platform to discuss their ideas, despite the fact that they're different. They can have a platform, and they can be open-minded to accept that they're different, but can still work towards the same goal. And she says that in the age of the internet, whereby social divisionism can be easily magnified, the only thing that can help in this age where tribalism and divisionism, as they said, is at its worst, is civil discourse. Because civil discourse, first of all, it allows you to acknowledge that there is no one version of the truth. Unlike the government that you've seen that clearly, just looks at one version of the truth, and this is what we're trying to prevent, by the way. Convicted civility simply shows that there are two versions of the truth. Yes, there is your version because you have your convictions, but there is another version that can and if both versions are brought together, instead of creating hatred, those two versions can be brought together to create something bigger. And then, convicted civility reaffirms human dignity. As she said previously, that civility was used to take away, to dehumanize people. It can still be used as a way to reaffirm human dignity in the sense that people, first of all, are going to be recognized as humans by other humans, because the main reason as to why violence happens is because humans see other humans as subhumans, as less than humans, and that's why violence happens. But with the convicted civility, it allows you to listen to others, and even if you disagree, you still give them the respect, and you still listen to others because you believe they're humans. And then convicted civility reminds us that whoever is behind the screen is also human. As she said, that in the age of internet, it is easy to throw aggressive and offensive opinions about the other. But with convicted civility, it accepts you and it allows you to acknowledge that there is a person behind it, and the person is still human. Now, the problem with unconvicted civility that the government is trying to advocate for today is that unconvicted civility makes us forget about history, in the sense that we have seen that throughout history, mass violence keeps on happening over and over again. And the main reason is that people never learn from history. For violence to occur, there has to be a them and us. There has to be polarization. There has to be divisionism. But what can we do to make sure that the history does not happen again? Convicted civility, obviously. Because if people are polarized and they're not brought together, violence is prone to happening again. So we advocate for convicted civility because we believe now than ever that people are more divided and more different. We believe that it's now time for convicted civility. It's now time for people to understand that despite the differences, they can achieve a common goal by coming together despite their differences. They don't have to give up on their convictions, but they just have to come together and make sure they work for a common goal. Thank you.